The portal closed behind you. You stumbled at the step downward. Your eyes adjusted to the dimness rapidly. The room on the other side of the portal was large. It looked like a basement facility of some sort. Only 2 people in the room. You knew them both. Katsumi Shinso, your best friend's dad turned villain, sat calmly on the dusty floor. A jarring sight even after everything that had just happened. Next to him, the Warp Gate villain lay on the ground, his misty form flowing in calm waves and ripples. His lightning bolt eyes were drawn into thin lines, giving the impression of sleep. You stared. "Any trouble, Shinso?" All For One asked Katsumi smoothly. "No," Katsumi shrugged. "He asked me to use Operate if he started to glitch, so I did. No problems." The careful slowness of Katsumi's motions and words made it click. He was controlling the Warp Gate villain, splitting his consciousness between the 2 of them. You couldn't look at Katsumi without anger glowing in your eyes, for what he'd done to Amaya and Hitoshi, and for what he'd done to you. But your feelings were confused now. Could it be true that Katsumi's interventions had saved you? Good. All For One's voice cut off your train of thought. Bring them back. Katsumi Shinso nodded, eerily keen gaze flicking to you for a moment before he closed his eyes and slumped back against the wall. Dozens of portals opened, villains falling and leaping back into the basement. The room filled quickly. Hopefully everyone at the training camp was okay. The attack hadn't lasted long, especially from the perspective of everyone else who hadn't been inside All For One's time-stop bubble. For you, it had felt like an eternity that led you here. It's for them, you reminded yourself. Your mind flashed over the faces of Aizawa, Hitoshi, all your friends, even Bakugo. Going with All For One had saved them for now. But they weren't safe yet. And they wouldn't be safe, not until you defeated All For One. How long would it take? How long would you have to lie? How many times would you have to turn your back on the people you cared about? Would they ever forgive you? Maybe not. Either you'd fail, and they'd find out in the most catastrophic way possible, or you'd succeed, and they might never know. But they would do the same for you. All For One's hand dropped to rest on your shoulder as the 2 of you surveyed the returning army. A gesture Aizawa had always reassured you with. You hated it from All For One, hated his touch. It felt like he was trying to replace Aizawa. But you held back your snarl and made your face impassive. You are the key player here, he spoke thoughtfully. But retrieving even our minor supporters remains important to recruitment. Kindness and loyalty are tools to gain trust, Eiko. He used your personal name as though he'd known you your entire life. Call me Aizawa. You felt the warmth leaving the gesture of his hand on your shoulder, heard the iciness in his tone. You would cling to the family name of the man who doesn't trust you? Interesting. You could have kicked yourself. Everyone's lives depended on you gaining All For One's trust, but already you were slipping, raising his suspicions. You decided to play it off as inner turmoil. If I'm not an Aizawa, who am I? All For One's iciness thawed slightly. There is time to figure that out. You will find yourself here, Eiko. I hope so, you whispered, trying to sound sincere. You will, All For One assured. I will personally see that you reach your potential, as I promised. You looked up at him with a trusting expression. Was he buying it? Your heart sank at his hard red eyes. You had a long way to go. Hawk's point of view. Hawks, the man too fast for his own good, was feeling very slow right now. Thousands upon thousands of journal entries from All For One. His bloodshot eyes continued scanning the words on the glowing screen. Hawks had been reading since Entry 1, the writing of an ambitious young man who wanted the world for himself and his brother. All For One talked about taking and giving quirks, using his ability to obtain a loyal population of followers. But something went wrong, about 10 years into the files. Mentions of his brother abruptly cut off, and the entries became shorter, more to the point. Stealing useful quirks such as an anti-aging quirk, enlisting the help of a scientist for research, strategizing a new plan. Amid the updates, All for One wrote about recurring themes, obsessions. The idea of people and societies being broken, the fascination with destruction, and a never-ending search for the right genetics. But genetics for what? He kept mentioning it in the notes about his research with Dr. Guraki. The search through family trees and certain bloodlines with the right genes, looking for someone who matched their criteria. Hawks narrowed his eyes at the top sentence of a new entry. Just a single sentence. A match has been found. He tapped his fingers on the armrest of his chair, rereading the words, but could decipher nothing more. The next entry had a tone of frustration to it. Subordinates are necessary, but sometimes it is better to complete tasks myself. They lost him. They let the target, Shota Aizawa, escape, and brought me one of his classmates instead. But the next entry was more optimistic. The mishap turned into an advantage. More research showed that the original target was too old, his genes not plastic enough. But the child shapeshifter who stowed away with his classmate has the perfect genetic makeup to fulfill the plan, and is still young enough that our intervention will work. Hawks continued to read. The secrets that Aizawa and Tsukauchi had been seeking for over a decade scrolled before his eyes. Your unique genetic resilience made you a match for taking on the power that All for One possessed, but was unable to wield without destroying himself. All for One set events in motion to assure that you would be emotionally broken, to send cracks spiderwebbing through your heart, so that you would finally understand the futility and hypocrisy of heroes, and the need for destruction. He deceived Katsumi Shinso, telling him that the drug was saving you from your unstable genes, when in reality, it was keeping them unstable as you aged, so that you would be able to gain the power he planned to give you. So that's what the drug did. You'd last long enough to fulfill his plan because your genetic regeneration was 9 times that of a normal person, the 9 lives of a cat. Even if you used up 1 regeneration on the destruction he had planned, you would have at least a life left over, to continue to be his pawn in the new world he planned to create. To All for One, using up 8 of your 9 lives was a small price to pay. All for One moved his chess pieces into place for the final act of his game. Tomura believed that he was going to be All for One's successor. Katsumi Shinso believed he would make the world a safe place for people with feared quirks. You believed that society was to blame for your emotional wounds. You were all wrong. Chess pieces. If only Hawks had waited a bit longer before getting his cover blown, then he could have known where the League of Villains relocated to. He could have known where you were right now. Hawks let out a long breath as he finished reading the last entry, then started to type. Tsukauchi was about to receive a report like he'd never received before. You opened your eyes, waking up to your 3rd day as All for One's apprentice. Those 3 days had felt like forever. What you wouldn't give to hear Dad's gruff voice say "problem child" as he wrapped you in one of his powerful hugs. Even a glare would be fine. Anything but this. Every bone in your body ached. So far, All for One's lessons felt like punishment. He didn't trust you yet. He wasn't going to help you become stronger until you convinced him that you really would play your part in his plans. You gritted your teeth, rising from your cot despite the discomfort. "Hey, Eiko!" Toga bounced over to you with her customary psychotic grin. It took every ounce of self-control to not glare at her. This was the same girl who had been trying to cut your friends apart 3 days ago. "Do you want something, Toga?" It came out a bit more icy than you intended, but hopefully she'd chalk it up to the "I'm a villain now" vibe. "All for One wants you to meet him in the lab," Toga grinned. "Maybe we can talk about our crushes after that." Not happening. "Thanks, Toga. See you later." You hadn't been outside since you came here, but based on the random equipment lying around, it seemed like the villains were based in an abandoned hospital. Your walk through the underground hallways was still and quiet, the only sounds from the friction of fabric on fabric as you walked in your hero costume. It turned out that most of the villains didn't bother with bathing or changing clothes. The maniac who had tried to incinerate Shinso, Dabi was his name, had a few spare shirts which he'd mockingly offered when you asked about clothing changes. But other than that, and the hoodie All for One had given you You were limited to your hero costume. How did All For One always stay so spotless? Even his suit shirts always seemed crisp, like they'd just been ironed. He was waiting in the lab with Dr. Garaki, a chubby bald scientist guy who wore round eye goggles. The scientist was quiet, except when he got excited, which seemed to happen every time All For One trained with you. "Ready, apprentice?" All For One asked coldly. "Yes." You extended your claws, already feeling the throbbing in your bones. You dropped flat on your hands and the balls of your feet as a crackling bolt of red energy shot over you. You immediately rolled to dodge another one. He walked towards you slowly, tossing the energy balls without any effort. "Eiko, already forgetting what I taught you. You need to catch, not dodge. You need to embrace it." That's what he'd been saying for the last few days, but his hard gaze made it clear that this was a test, or a punishment. Probably both, because there was no way anyone could catch the destructive bolts of power he was rapid-firing at you. Oh, you tried, and you'd have to ignore your aching bones and screaming instincts and try again, and again. As another crackling scarlet blaze hurtled towards you, you locked your knees and gritted your teeth, feeling your eyes already sting, as if your body knew what was coming. You caught it. It zipped through your extended claws, crackling up your arms and through your body. You screamed, unable to stop your voice from tearing through the air, and didn't notice yourself falling until you hit the floor on your hands and knees. "You have to breathe," All For One repeated calmly. "Inhale it, let it in. Don't fight it." Well, you tried. And it did seem to enter your body, but if anything, that only made the pain more excruciating, sending splintering bolts of agony through your bones. All For One always held back after you were hit. Considerate of him, you thought sarcastically, since you were immobilized with muscle tremors for at least a minute after trying to catch one of the energy balls. You got back to your feet on trembling legs and met All For One's eyes. At some point, he'd have to see your commitment. He'd have to acknowledge that you'd done everything he'd ever asked. What would give in first? His reluctance to trust you, or your physical and mental resilience? His cold eyes indicated only mild curiosity, as though he was making a bet about it himself. After 2 hours, All For One called it a day. Dr. Garaki rushed over to you, lifting your arm, taking a small blood sample without your consent. "Stay away from me!" you spat, still trembling from the last energy blast. You doubted that the childish gremlin of a man would dare to take a blood sample when you could move. He'd seen what your claws could do. But, muscles still lacking motor control, you were forced to watch as he began giddily centrifuging the small tube in the lab. His fascination didn't make sense. You weren't actually getting stronger. Was he simply interested in how long it would take for All For One's brutal training to kill you? Laying on the ground in your own sweat, trembling, pale, immobilized by pain, what would Aizawa think if he could see you now? The question formed tears in your eyes, so you shoved thoughts of home away. You couldn't afford the luxury of weakness. You wobbled onto your feet as soon as you could. You had half a mind to slash apart some of Dr. Garaki's fancy equipment for taking a blood sample while you were down. But you held back. It wasn't worth jeopardizing your mission. You used the wall for support as you staggered back into the main base room on legs that felt about as stable as a baby deer's. Kurogiri appeared next to you, and you hastily pulled up the hood over your cat ears. It was one of your master's strictest rules. Cats triggered the Warp Gate villain, he'd said. You vaguely remembered the truth of that from the USJ. "Hello, Eiko," Kurogiri greeted. "How did training go today?" You grimaced. You weren't sure what to make of the enigmatic person next to you. Always polite, formal, and... "You seem to be moving with difficulty," Kurogiri observed, his dark violet mist flickering in agitation. "Would you like me to teleport you to your quarters?" "Yes, please." You accepted his offer quickly. A misty portal swirled into view, opening a direct entrance to your cot in midair. You staggered through the cool mist, collapsing forward into the cot with a sigh of relief. "Thank you." "My pleasure." Kurogiri's voice faded as the portal vanished. Always polite, formal and unexpectedly kind. How did someone like that end up with the League of Villains? Did he simply look too bizarre to fit in with society? Bullying of people with unusual appearances from quirks was an all too common issue in the world. But even still, you couldn't imagine people disliking someone so kind and considerate once they got to know him. But he was a villain, you reminded yourself. He'd do anything for Shigaraki. You closed your eyes, remembering the way Kurogiri had lifted you off your feet during the USJ attack. You may not understand his loyalty to Shigaraki, but you couldn't deny it. And that might be a problem, because Shigaraki detested you. It was obvious from his refusal to speak to you, his scathing glares, his extra scratching when you were around. Toga said that he was jealous, because All For One was giving you extra training. If he wants my extra training, he can have it, you'd replied emphatically. Toga had burst into giggles, not seeming to realize that you were dead serious. Your feelings towards members of this criminal league were never quite warm and fuzzy, but among all the villains you were getting to know, you still hated Katsumi the most. Sure, All For One claimed that he'd saved your life, but was that any excuse for the way he'd abandoned Amaya and left Hitoshi fatherless? You didn't trust Katsumi's supposedly noble reasons. As though conjured by your thoughts, Katsumi strolled into the sleeping area and sauntered over to you. I hope that you don't make that face at All For One, he noted with infuriating calmness. I don't, because I don't hate him the way I hate you. Ouch. Katsumi grinned in a dry way that made your heart hurt by similarity to Hitoshi. But I'm sure that All For One would be touched to know that you don't hate him. You stiffened at the subtle threat. He knew. He wasn't buying your villain act or your show of commitment to All For One. And if he wasn't buying it, it was unlikely that All For One was buying it either. What do you want? You snapped. His keen gaze flicked over to you. I want my son back. What does that even mean? He smiled without humor. I've seen how close you two are. You're his best chance of bringing him to our side before the victory. You considered the proposition. It would seem suspicious if you refused. Who wouldn't want their best friend on their side? But why do you care? You glared. You've been ignoring him for his entire life. Katsumi's eyes flashed. Everything I've ever done, he snapped, stepping closer, has been for him. You stared as the words sunk in. His words seemed sharp and honest, none of the usual teasing and mocking. But how could he possibly think that everything he'd done had been for Hitoshi's sake? Toga's voice interrupted your conversation with Katsumi as she called you over to the TV. Eiko, come see this! It's someone you know! Dread. You walked over slowly. Another press conference with Aizawa. The last time you'd seen him, he'd been frantically throwing himself against an invisible barrier. He was much calmer now, under the cameras, but you could just make out the sharper worry lines and darker smudges under his eyes. Guilt twinged in your heart. As usual, the news reporters were going berserk, their voices shouting on top of each other. You didn't have to make out complete sentences to know what they were saying. You closed your eyes. Did you have to watch this? Shigaraki's voice spoke with satisfaction. Eraserhead is retiring? Good. Cool as he was also problematic. Your eyes snapped open to glance at him, then at the screen. Sure enough, the scrolling title read, Eraserhead faces retirement. Your eyes widened as you remembered the risk he'd taken, the promise he'd made in front of the world. This was where staking his future on you had gotten him. On the screen, Aizawa made no effort to silence the reporters, so someone finally stepped in to moderate. Questions slowed to one at a time. How does it feel, knowing that your daughter is a villain? A spark of emotion lit Aizawa's eyes as he looked up and fixed his gaze on the speaker. Do you have any last words before you retire? Shouted another. Aizawa's hair began swirling weightlessly. What would you say to Eiko Aizawa if you could speak to her now? A flash of light emanated from Aizawa's gaze as his eyes took on a crimson glow. Enough! After years of dealing with unruly high school students, he knew how to silence a crowd. His hair continued to swirl weightlessly as he glared on the TV screen. I promised that if Eiko harmed another person, I would hang up my cape and retire. She still hasn't harmed anyone else. He stared directly into the camera. Problem child. If you somehow hear this, I will find you. I will bring you safely back. And, he growled, you are so grounded. Aizawa spun on his heel, his back to the crowd of cameras as he set down his mic and strode out a backstage door. You stared, barely registering the rising volume of protest from the crowd on the TV. Your throat felt tight with the feelings you were holding in. Not traitor, not villain, just problem child, same as always. He trusted you. You became aware of all the villains waiting for your reaction, trying to read the emotion in your face, the tears forming in your eyes. Your hands clenched into fists. Time to put on a show. He thinks he can just treat me like a child, make peace with my enemies, expect me to run back home? You glared at the screen, tears still welling in your eyes. But I'm not looking for peace. He'll eat his words when I bring this stupid society full of people who hate me crashing down. You slashed the wall in anger, claws raising sparks from the surface as you spun on your heel and left, mirroring Aizawa's abrupt exit. The villains were talking in the room behind you as you strode away. Toga emotional from your speech, wanting to go comfort you, Dabi snapping to give you space, and Shigaraki scoffing at both of them. Katsumi gave a low, mocking whistle. Not bad, it seemed to say. Not bad. You found a corner behind some old equipment and leaned against the wall, sinking down and wrapping your arms around your knees. Dad trusted you. Hot tears slipped silently down your cheeks and were absorbed by the cloth on your knees. Weeks of stress and pressure finally put to rest. Until now, you hadn't understood what he meant by I trust you. You finally got it. It wasn't conditional upon refusing to walk through the portal, or even refusing to become a villain. As usual, Aizawa had the bigger picture in mind. He trusted in who you were, in your heart. As your tears slowed, your mind settled in resolve. This wasn't working. You weren't fooling All for One. You had to become the role, lose yourself enough to convince them without losing yourself completely. You'd been holding back, afraid of becoming what society thought you were. But now that you've understood the depth of Aizawa's trust in you, your fear was gone. If he could continue believing in you, even after seeing you walk through that portal, then you could continue believing in your mission as a hero, no matter how deeply you played the part of a villain. It took a while of sorting through your thoughts and getting into the mindset you would need. You dried your tears and stood up as a new person, the person you needed to be in order to gain All for One's trust and defeat him. Hi guys, thanks for listening to part 32 of the Irrational series. Thank you all so much for supporting through likes, comments, and channel memberships. Take care of yourselves and have a great week.